go ahead and get started. This is absolutely amazing. Good to see all of you. And I will say that this space is so cozy. I didn't expect it to be this cozy, but it makes it even better because the energy in this room is really palpable. And I was talking to people earlier, just realizing how strong and diverse of a network we are as HDC, with different people from different sectors, from different parts of the sector, and it's really energizing the work that's ahead of us. And happy Affordable Housing Week, everybody! Well, it is my great honor to welcome you today on behalf of the HDC board. And we have our board vice chair over there. If you could raise your hand, and thank you so much for the work you do. I'm also welcoming you on behalf of the staff of HDC. This is a special day every year where affordable housing advocates come together with elected officials, with community members to kick off Affordable Housing Week and talk about the regional housing crisis and, more importantly, the solutions to address it. As an association of 190 members, we recognize that achieving our vision of housing all people in safe, healthy, and affordable homes requires all of us to do our part. We are only stronger together. Before I tell you the story of Affordable Housing Week, I want to take a moment and thank the generosity of our sponsors who you see listed here. I also want to take a moment and recognize the extraordinary dedication and commitment of the HDC staff who made this week possible. Special thanks to Chad Vaculin, who I don't see here, but he's somewhere outside helping folks come in, and the rest of the HDC team for their support of Chad in coordinating and shepherding this week to be a success. And many thanks to our Policy Advisory Group Chair, Jesse Simpson, who's over there, who has been of great support in this time. Now let me tell you the story of Affordable Housing Week and why we are here. 7 years ago, HDC started a tradition emulating an effort that was and continues to happen right now in California Bay Area, where the East Bay Housing Organization is in its 27th Affordable Housing Week. In fact, they now celebrate Affordable Housing Month. This was in response to advocates who were asking HDC how to get engaged in advocating for affordable housing. It was also in response to the tremendous needs then, and really in aiming to create our own advocacy opportunities. 7 years later, this tradition continues at a time when the need for affordable housing in our region is greater than ever. And we need to do everything we can to increase the supply and access to affordable housing. It continues at a time when making housing a human right and the foundation for a community to thrive is further threatened by the escalating rent increases averaging 10% plus. In fact, in Seattle, there's a report that indicates that we have gone up 18% in some cases. In some parts of the region, home prices are averaging $1 million. In East Bellevue, that is the average home price. The cost increases could not come at a worse time, with pressures from inflation compounding the impact of high housing costs. The underproduction of affordable housing continues. In the face of increasing costs of material, in the face of increasing costs to develop. In fact, over the last 5 years, the cost of development has gone up about 24%. Interest rates are also increasing, and now they're approaching 5%. Land costs are increasing, yet we have limited resources to support the creation and preservation of affordable housing. We have zoning policies that only limit the ability to address the crisis. And we have systemic inequities that continue to be laid bare by the hardships from the pandemic. Black, Indigenous, and people of color and low-income families are disproportionately impacted. They're impacted with a higher share of them being housing cost burdened or experiencing homelessness. We are, as a region, fast losing our economic and ethnic diversity. Affordable Housing Week recognizes that housing affordability can't wait for a council agenda. It can't wait for others to take on this work. We need to act as advocates in partnership with our elected officials. We need to show up and testify at City Council. We need you as affordable housing providers to schedule meetings or tours with your elected officials. Show them what affordable housing of today looks like. We need more of you to be talking to your neighbors, to your boards, to make them understand that we need more and better, effective, affordable housing solutions. Because we know one thing, we just can't wait. We are indeed facing an exacerbated and sustained state of emergency. And that means all hands on deck. We need the energy and determination of this movement to make an impact. Now, I talked about energy and determination in the room, and there is nobody that exemplifies this energy and determination and drive in advocating for affordability than Kathleen Hosfeld, who is our Advocate of the Year. The Advocate of the Year award recognizes HDC members who have stepped up to lead and have inspired others in doing so in advancing our collective advocacy agenda. Kathleen, you probably don't remember this, but one of my first meetings in joining HDC was a policy meeting where I was inspired by her words, where she was just adamant about prioritizing home ownership. And those words have never left me. And at every meeting with Kathleen, those words have come up. And that has pushed us as an organization, as an association, to prioritize home ownership. Last year, we launched a really comprehensive effort and collaborative effort in kicking off the Black Homeownership 7-point plan. And I don't believe some of that work would have happened without the advocacy that Kathleen has really moved forward. So we are proud to award Kathleen Hosfeld as the 2022 Advocate of the Year. So just a little bit of bio on Kathleen. Kathleen is the Executive Director at Homestead Community Land Trust, and she is being recognized today for her work and advocacy in creating equitable and permanently affordable home ownership opportunities. Kathleen, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Patience. And I just have a couple of minutes of remarks. I'll help us get back on track in terms of time. This is a remarkable moment for a variety of reasons, not the least of which because this recognizes the importance of affordable homeownership in the housing continuum in a way that it was not recognized maybe 2 years ago. So I'm deeply honored. But I don't work alone, and I credit staff, board, my mentors, our community partners with the advocacy that this award recognizes. How many of you have watched the Men in Black movies? All right, so you probably will remember with me the scene where Griffin, who is a character who is the last member of the fictitious Arcanan race, he has the ability to foresee infinite future potential outcomes that are dependent on the choices we make in any given moment. At one point in the movie, he draws the Men in Black agents to Shea Stadium to relive the Mets winning the 1969 World Series, which he says, with shining tears in his eyes, is his favorite moment in human history. And he talks about the myriad small details that contributed to the outcome. A flaw in the construction of a baseball, a specific tree that grew to become carved into the winning bat. It's not my favorite moment in human history, Councilmember Mosqueda, but it's one of my favorites when we worked together with Councilmember Herbold's office and her staff and your staff to get homeownership funding in the Jumpstart spending plan starting this year. So thank you for that. Just one of those little moments in time. But just like that World Series win, every time we create an affordable affordable homeownership opportunity, it's a miracle. The gifts from the land, wood and stone and metal that we build with, the person that was born that loves to swing a hammer, the other person who fills in the little dot on their Levy ballot saying yes, and the thousands more that join them. All these little tiny details come together to create the moment when somebody puts a key in the lock of their door first time, and as their ancestors cheer from afar or from beyond. And as much as I appreciate this recognition, I have to say I am not a great advocate, and there are some probably within the sound of my voice who would say, don't encourage her, she's really annoying. But what I aspire to be is one of those players who, when they're on the field or on the court, everyone's stats go up. Who, when they're present, everyone plays better and does better, because we must do better for the people who are shut out of prosperity and the privilege that many of us enjoy. The decision to rent or own should be a choice, not a decision made by me or by anyone else on someone else's behalf. I am so grateful for Patient's leadership and inclusion of homeownership in her priorities as she assumes the executive directorship of HDC. And let's follow her lead. Let's create a robust housing continuum that repairs past harms, that addresses current barriers and systemic inequities, and creates a foundation for shared prosperity and abundance for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen. I don't see where Ryan is, but Ryan is a partner to Kathleen, and I often have my bingo in policy advisory group meetings when they start emphasizing their homeownership priorities. So, Ryan, I believe this is also in honor of you. At this particular moment, we are really delighted to have with us a panel of great leaders who I will invite to join us up here for a discussion. Gregg Colburn, who is joining us sit up here, and then Councilmember Zahilay, Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda, who is also joining us. I do want to take a moment and acknowledge the elected officials who are in the room joining us today. Representative Chop, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the great work you do. I believe I saw Senator Hasagawa. Thank you so much, and thank you for your leadership. If I missed any, I do apologize. I may have missed seeing you at the entrance. But thank you all for the work you do. Well, we will be discussing a book that was written by Gregg Colburn and Clayton Page about homelessness, and I got to ask Gregg to sign my book earlier. And we have two champions here who are really tireless advocates for affordable housing, Councilmember Girmay Zahilay and Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda, and we will be discussing policies and a lot of what's coming out with insights from Gregg's work. But to open up, we'll start with just personal questions. Can you tell us how you got into this space? What has driven you to do this work? Why is affordable housing such an integral part of your work? Maybe we'll start with you, Councilmember.
Well, thank you so much, Patience. It's wonderful to be here. Congratulations, Kathleen. Congratulations to everyone for all that you've done to make Affordable Housing Week an annual event. And I want to make it a month-long event like they're doing in the Bay Area, so we're going to work on that. It's really thrilling to be here and to be sitting next to Councilmember Zahilay, who's really taken the mantle and fighting for affordable housing in King County. It's wonderful to have a champion at the county level, and thank you as well. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Gregg. I really appreciate the perspective that we're bringing to this conversation in Seattle and our region, because as folks can tell, housing is the most important thing that we have to fight for, to make sure that there is more affordable housing for everyone, so that those who are living unsheltered currently have a place to call home, and that for those who are living here have a place they can call a permanent affordable housing, for permanent affordable home, and for all the people who are coming, whether they're refugees and immigrants, whether they're economic refugees seeking to start their own business, or workers coming here for a good living wage job, whether they're folks who are fleeing environmental crises across this country and this globe, who are coming to the Puget Sound for a more stable environment to live in. We do not have enough housing currently for the folks who live here, and the housing that needs to be built for the folks who are coming, and frankly for the future of the city that we want to be, that's walkable, bikeable, friendly, housed, healthy, and safe for everyone. That requires housing. How I got into this work is a little bit of a roundabout way, because my focus in the past was on health insurance, on health care, and looking at Speaker Frank Chop. He and I worked together for a long time on creating Apple Health for Kids, knowing it was the first step for healthcare for all, healthcare as a human right. And as we fought for healthcare, for that plastic insurance medical card that sits in your pocket, in your wallet, if you're lucky enough to have a good union job that provides it, or if you've been privileged enough to be able to afford health insurance in this country, because unfortunately, like many of all of the other industrialized countries in the world, we don't have universal health care, which we will fight to change at the congressional level. But knowing what creates healthy individuals and healthy populations is not that plastic medical insurance card in your pocket, which we will fight like hell to make sure everybody has. It's actually the ability to have a place to call home, the ability to speak up in your workplace if you are experiencing oppression or working in toxic environment. It's the ability to take a day off when you're sick, or to care for a loved one and not feel like you're making an impossible decision on losing a day's wage and having to care for your loved ones. And knowing that housing is at the cornerstone of whether or not somebody is able to be healthy is what I think has been part of my journey to go for fighting for affordable health insurance and health insurance for everyone, to making sure that everyone is housed so that people can actually be healthy. And nothing's underscored that more than the pandemic over the last 2.5 years. Quite literally, we tell people to stay home, to stay healthy. When we have thousands of people living unhoused in our city and county, but also thousands more who are living economically unstable and in housing unstable situations. And many of us who are just on the brink of a paycheck away from being unhoused ourselves. So fighting for health care is an element of fighting for a healthy population. Fighting for housing is how we create healthy communities and healthy populations. And that's where I see the connection continue between fighting for that insurance medical card and actually having a roof over your head. It's all about making healthy communities.
From now on, I want to go first. I don't want to. Great. Thank you all so much for being here today. It's really just great to be in front of a group of people who have done so much to impact and benefit people who need affordable housing in our region. So just thank you. Give yourselves a round of applause if you're okay with that. Thank you. I'm Girmay Zahilay. I'm a King County Councilmember, and I have the honor and privilege of representing the district that raised me. You know, all I have to do is go down MLK or Renton Avenue South to see the moments that brought me to this work, that inspired me to get into this work. I grew up in places like Rainier Vista and Holly Park, which is now called New Holly, which are public housing. And those were quote unquote affordable for my single mom, and that was great, but it came with trade-offs. If you're growing up in public housing in the 90s, we weren't doing a great job of making those livable and making those places where you could find environmental justice. So we were living with roaches, mice. Half the kids that I knew were growing up with asthma, and that's just the environment that it was. And so, like many parents who are low income and living in situations like that, my mom had to make a trade-off, and that trade-off was, I'm gonna take on a second job and move my kids to a place where they can where we can buy a home, and we moved south to Skyway. And that was the first time we ever lived in a home that she purchased. But now there are some trade-offs. It's no longer affordable for her because she has 2 jobs that she has to go, she's get to work at 2:15 p.m. and then work through the evening and the night shift and come back at 7 a.m. every day. And so us as kids who, we're going home and not seeing any family members, any parents, latchkey kids as they call them. And when you're in Skyway, Rebecca, you can attest to this, there's not a lot of public transit options. So suddenly we don't have a way to get to and from the places we need to go. We suddenly are not having a community center and after school activities. So the kinds of emotional, developmental impacts that has on kids, that's huge. And the last thing I want to say about that is all of a sudden at one point in the 2000s, the interest rates suddenly went up for that home. And so my mom actually had to pick up a 3rd job. So she would go 2:15 until 7 a.m. and then instead of going to sleep in that 8 hours until she has to start again, she would have to go and get a 3rd job where she was going and cleaning people's homes for a few more hours just to make that gap. And the worst story she ever told me is one day she was rushing from that job at 7 a.m. to this 3rd job that she got, and she was late to this 3rd job, and police pulled her over for speeding, and so suddenly she got a $260 ticket. $260 when you're making $10 an hour, erased like weeks of work that she had done, back-breaking labor. And so I tell these stories because it's just really important to remember that affordable housing, of course, is about the physical space where you can go to survive and raise your kids, but it also impacts transportation. It impacts environmental justice. It impacts how much of your wages you get to take home and do things like having more freedom and agency over your time. It impacts how well your kids do in school. It impacts so many different things. And so when you all are gathering here to make that important work happen, it means so much to so many people that you probably don't even know and don't even see. So thank you.
Thank you all. Can you hear me? My name is Gregg Colburn from the University of Washington. It's an interesting question of what got me interested in this topic. I'm a second career academic. My first career was in finance, and I was an investor in New York and Chicago for a long time. And so it's a rather circuitous route to get to the topic of affordable housing. I really got interested in this. There are two events that happened to me while I was working in the private sector that stuck with me. One was I was working in New York, and I would ride the subway to work every day downtown. And this was 1995, and Mayor Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani was mayor, and he was cleaning up Manhattan at that point. It was not unusual for me to get on the subway and see someone sleeping on the seats. Likely that person was experiencing homelessness. And I remember the cops coming on and grabbing usually they were men, out of their deep sleep and kind of the fear on their face and dragging them away. And I remember thinking, I wonder where they're going. And I realized after living in New York for a while that this was a spatial solution to the problem. That we weren't necessarily ending homelessness, we were moving it, such that Manhattan was more pleasant for people like me who lived and worked there, for the tourists that came to Manhattan. So that was kind of interesting. And then I moved to Chicago, and the firm that I worked for sponsored a Little League team. We're getting back to the baseball metaphor here. So I coached Little League baseball in Cabrini Green for 2 summers. And that was a very, very eye-opening experience for a white kid from the suburbs of Minneapolis. And this is right before the towers came down, and a lot of these boys were being moved and their families to the Robert Taylor homes, which is down on the south side by Comiskey Park. And so those 2 summers were a crash course in urban living for me. And I really got focused on this idea of housing being kind of the core of life. And so when I decided to leave my first career and get my PhD, I decided to focus on housing because there are a lot of outcomes in society that we all care about. Educational outcomes, labor market, health, all these things, that I think are jeopardized and undermined without housing. And if we don't get the housing thing right, we can spend all the time we want on housing, but it's really hard for kids to get educated if they don't have a house. And so to me, it's kind of a Maslow's hierarchy point here, that we gotta get this figured out, and then we can start worrying about these other outcomes that we care about. So that's why I've decided to focus on this topic.
What amazing stories. Thank you for sharing. Gregg, we'll start with you this time. I read and completed your book this week. Very insightful book, and I encourage all of you to read the research. And for all of you who may not be aware of what the book really focuses on, it covers a range of analyzing the variation in terms of rates of homelessness in different cities. And I think you impressively use accessible statistics. I'm not a fan of statistics, but I was able to really digest a lot of what was covered within your book. And you assess different conventional beliefs of why homelessness happens, from the individual framings where people like to look at mental health, they like to look at poverty or income status. But then you conclude, really, that those singularly do not on their own explain the reason for homelessness, but rather it's important that we look at the structural challenges, and that's where really systems change can happen. And you talk extensively about how the housing market conditions are actually part of that structure in limiting people's access to homes or access to affordable housing. So if you could tell us a little bit more about your research, just an overview for folks to understand where you're coming from with this.
Sure, thank you, Patience. So I got to the University of Washington in 2017 and have been involved with many people in this room in conversations around housing. And probably a year or 2 in, I realized that we didn't have a good collective sense, I didn't think, in our community of what was driving the homelessness crisis, and it seemed to be getting worse every day. And my fear was that a lack of proper diagnosis was going to lead to inadequate or misaligned policy responses. And so, in getting back to Chicago, my family's from the Midwest. We were back there in the summer on vacation, and we were downtown on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, and our daughter, who's now a senior in high school, was 14 at the time, looked around and she said, "There aren't a lot of homeless people here." It was interesting. And I said, "You're right, there aren't." And so I kind of went back and was thinking, and I've heard this from a lot of people. I've gone to other cities and I don't see this. Why do we have such a problem here? So I decided to write a book explaining why we have such a problem here. And the purpose of the book is to explain regional variation, is to answer the question that my 14-year-old daughter highlighted when we were walking around Chicago. Why do we have it here and not there? It's complicated, but ultimately, the punchline here, and it's hard to distill a book down into 2 or 3 minutes here, but the point that is really, really important is that we know from research what the individual drivers and risk factors for homelessness are. Poverty, illness, drugs, we know the list. If you read the newspaper work on this, you know that. The challenge that we have is that the drivers of homelessness at a community level are different. We do not have more people who use drugs in Seattle than other communities. We do not have more people experiencing mental illness. We have far fewer people living in poverty here than in other places like Cleveland or Detroit. The consequences of those conditions are much more significant in a place where housing is scarce. So the point of the book is to highlight the fact that scarce housing, in terms of insufficient quantity and really high prices, accentuates individual vulnerabilities. There are people with vulnerabilities in every community around the country. The consequences of those are very different. We don't have a homelessness problem where poverty is greatest, Detroit, Michigan, most impoverished city in the country, 1/5 of our homelessness. We don't have a homelessness problem where drug use is rampant, where the opioid epidemic has ravaged communities in Arkansas and West Virginia. We don't have a homelessness problem there. Why? Because housing is accessible. Not to say these aren't issues, they're absolutely issues. Should we treat mental illness? Absolutely. Should we provide support to people with substance use issues? Absolutely. But I firmly believe, and I think the evidence is there, that we cannot treat our way out of this problem. I think we have a moral obligation to treat, but if we think that that's going to end this crisis, I don't think that's the case. And so ultimately, we need to look at the structure. Could we have centered other issues in this book? Could we have centered race? Certainly we could. Could we have centered income inequality? Yes. We chose to center housing because I think all those things play in. We see huge racial disparities when housing is scarce. We see inequality produces disparate income outcomes, disparate housing outcomes. So ultimately, we had this debate, Clay and I, in terms of how to center it, and we ultimately decided on housing. So if we get down to, if you buy the argument, you may not, and that's fine, but if you buy the argument that housing helps to explain why we have variation in rates of homelessness, the question then would be, why do we have this housing market in Seattle that's very different than other communities around the country? And that's where we get into economics, which is supply and demand. The demand for housing is really high here because we have a lot of people moving here, they get paid a lot, and we have a really, really robust labor market. But there are other places in the country that are growing and that have lots of jobs. Charlotte, North Carolina, Austin, Texas. They don't have the same problems we do. Why? Well, it's because of the supply side. We have robust demand for housing and insufficient supply. And part of that is explained by the mountains and water, which make it hard to build housing here. But part of it is we have not created an environment in which housing can be built. And so when you combine robust demand for housing and insufficient supply, you end up with a housing crisis. And therefore, I tell people, what we're experiencing right now shouldn't surprise anyone. It's tragic, it's frustrating, it pisses me off, but it shouldn't surprise anyone. And people say, well, give me an example of someone who's doing it well. Goose egg, we don't have a good example. We don't have an example of a fast-growing place that has responded. You know, the places that are doing well are places with accommodating housing markets. You can fix homelessness in Dayton, Ohio by getting someone a TANF check, getting them signed up for public assistance, and they have enough money to afford a rental unit. I'm not disparaging Dayton, Ohio and the people doing good work there. I'm grateful that they're taking advantage of the opportunity they have, which is accommodating housing market and to fix this problem. We're not going to be Dayton, Ohio anytime soon. And therefore, we need to be thinking about how then are we going to accommodate all the people who want to continue to live and work in this amazing region. And if we don't do that, my fear is that this problem that we observe just walking around will continue to get worse. And absent major intervention, I think we need it. I was in Bellevue on Easter Sunday. My uncle had just read the book. He's been in Bellevue since 1979, and he said something that was really profound to me. He said, after reading this, I feel like we need a Marshall Plan, right? A large-scale intervention, because nibbling around the edges, the scale of the problem is such that we need something more. And so the point is that our interventions, people say to me, Greg, we spent X and the problem's gotten worse, and I always say, well, X isn't enough. It doesn't mean that X doesn't work. X does work, and in fact, it would be worse if we hadn't done anything, but the problem is our response has not been sufficient to the scale of the problem. So anyway, that's the point of the book. Thank you very much for having me, patience. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg. So from what you heard from Greg, what role do local governments play in addressing the housing crisis? What have we done really well in terms of policies and programs we've passed, and where are we falling short? And Greg, I want to bring you into this question as well, because your book talks a lot about federal investments and how we've fallen short there and how there's an impact on local governments. So we'll come back to you, but we'll start with the local governments.
I also don't want to go after Gregg. So. That was really good. I was like taking notes on like the specific phrases you were using. I was like, oh wow, I have that weird complex idea, but you said it in such a short and punchy way. So great job. Thank you. I'm gonna read that book now. So what role do local governments play? We play a huge role, but I do want to first acknowledge that what you said about the federal government patience, I think there are just so many times where I'm talking to a neighborhood group or a reporter, and for some reason their goal is to try to get me to blame the Seattle City Council for stuff. Blame the Seattle City Council. And my response to them is, yes, hold the Seattle City Council accountable, but why do we never focus on other levels of government, which have, the federal government has basically just washed its hands of responsibility to housing. Every decade, less and less investment, even though the problem is getting bigger and bigger. So if I could make one recommendation to advocates in the audience, hold every level of government accountable to the same level that you hold the Seattle City Council accountable. Yes, and that, again, that's not, don't hold the Seattle City Council accountable. You can still yell at Teresa. No, I'm joking. But King County, Washington State, the federal government, all of us need to play a much bigger role. And it's really hard, especially at the King County level, because of the restrictions on the type of taxes we're able to raise. We're not going to fix the housing crisis by increasing property taxes. We're not going to fix the housing crisis by increasing sales taxes. That is just a backwards way of doing things, and yet those are the tools that we have at the King County level. So we really need our state, our federal government, other levels of government that have progressive options that can share the tremendous wealth that this region and the state are generating and put that into housing investments, because people are going to keep moving here, as they should, and we welcome new people moving here. And at the same time, we also need to address this extremely restrictive zoning policies that we have at the local level. You know, I'm sure Teresa, you're going to touch on this, but 75% of the residential land in Seattle, for example, zoned for single-family detached homes. I took a trip recently to Germany as part of go learn from other localities what kind of stuff they're doing. And there are so many places that are just shocked that we have zoning the way that we do. You know, you can have nice looking, quaint, quiet neighborhoods that have duplexes and triplexes. That's not a hard thing to do. And yet we still have these kind of burdens on the ability to build dense, walkable neighborhoods. And so I think we have a big role in addressing these issues, and we have a lot of work to do. At the same time, like you said, patience, it's all hands on deck. We need every level of government to intervene. We need a big Marshall Plan like Gregg was talking about, because nibbling around the edges is just not working.
Well, now I don't want to go after you ever again. Let me just add to what you said then. I hope it complements, because this is truly a thought partnership that I think we're going to continue to have across Seattle and King County as we seek to address this crisis. And the crisis is a $1 billion problem. In King County, we know to address the housing shortage that we currently have right now, we need about 45,000 people to be housed. There is a 45,000 number that's associated with the number of individuals, friends, neighbors, sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, who are experiencing homelessness in King County right now. And in order for us to house just those who are here in our county, we need somewhere between $450 million on the conservative side up to $1 billion in funding a year. And that doesn't come from just me penciling it out. This comes from the McKinsey analysis that is largely working with businesses across our region who have said $1 billion a year. So when we say we need every tool in our tool belt, that's correct. But when the question's also asking what can we do at the local level, we have to continue to hold ourselves accountable, as the council member has noted, to recognize that the problems related to the crisis of housing, including zoning, but also lending practices and policies that have been discriminatory in the past and continue to be discriminatory, are built in local policy. And probably a colleague of yours, the author of The Color of Law, talks a lot about how The policies that we point to as problems for prohibiting people from getting into housing, racist restrictive covenants, redlining policies prohibiting people from living in our cities, here in Seattle and across the United States, these are local policies that, yes, in many cases follow national guidance or national policies, but we have local tools to undo those policies. And it starts with zoning, I believe, as well. We must rezone our city and make sure that we have a truly inclusive Seattle. And I hope that reading Gregg's book can help emphasize that to those who think that this is somehow a unique problem to folks who are experiencing some level of a health crisis. Absolutely not. It is a housing crisis, and I appreciate the summary as well that Gregg just articulated. And let's also not forget that many folks who are experiencing homelessness have a job. They have a job in our market and cannot afford a place to rent, a place to buy, or have housing stability. So in terms of local tools, yes, we need to rezone our city, and we're actively working on it. Please participate in the comprehensive plan analysis that's happening this year to inform the policy discussion for 2023, because we're going to have a comprehensive plan redo opportunity in 2024. That sounds like forever away. So what are we doing in the meantime? We're fighting to make sure that there's more funding going into creating more affordable housing. And thanks to you, thanks to the partners at Housing Development Consortium and hundreds of organizations across Seattle, we passed Jumpstart Progressive Revenue. And I see folks from Real Change here, Real Change, all the way to businesses, GSBA, folks at Housing Development Consortium. This was a broad coalition that said we need to have millions of dollars coming into the city, and we want the vast majority to go into building affordable housing. And just this year alone, we saw about $250 million coming in from a progressive tax. Not a regressive tax using existing tools, but a new progressive tax on our highest salaries and on the largest companies with the largest payroll in Seattle. And it didn't lead to businesses shutting down. In fact, we're seeing that Seattle has some of the highest numbers of startup companies starting right here in our city. What's good for folks in terms of housing is also good for economic opportunity and economic regeneration in our city. It is paying it forward, and we are going to now be able to put over $270 million from Jumpstart is going to go to our city, and 2/3 of that is going to go to housing next year. That's about $170 million. And that alone is not enough, but it makes a big dent. And in terms of Jumpstart, it's not just about putting money into creating housing and builders. It's about putting funding forward to make sure that we're undoing those historic wrongs that was talked about. Kathleen used that term. We must intentionally repair past harms. So with the Jumpstart funding, we've also said this needs to go to home ownership opportunities so that folks can get out of generational poverty and have first-time home ownership opportunities. We celebrated that with Africa Town and Homestead Community Land Trust last weekend. We celebrated that as well with Habitat for Humanity 2 weekends ago when folks actually got the key to their homes. We're creating thousands of affordable housing units that is through rental units as well, and we're making sure that we're increasing weatherization opportunities so folks can stay in their homes and prevent folks from displacement as building changes occur. And a lot of this funding has been historic in terms of the level of funding that's gone into building affordable housing, but we also changed internal sort of alphabet soup policies, and thanks to Emily Alvarado, who led the Office of Housing and worked with us in partnership. We came to Emily and from the Community Housing Roundtable that we convene on a quarterly basis that is led by many HDC members who are community of color leaders working in nonprofit organizations, led by folks of color, working to house and serve folks of color, who said, yes, thank you for increasing the amount of funding, but we are still having to compete with other developers who've been doing this for a very long time. We changed the policy, we fixed some of the alphabet soup, and now we've prioritized community organizations who are rooted in and led by folks of color who are trying to address displacement and build new housing opportunities. Those are some of the policies that we've changed at the local level, but we have to continue to do more and to fight for more funding, more opportunity for folks to get into those housing units. And I'll conclude with this. We've also stopped the city from selling its public property on the private market. I came into office just as the Western Mega Block was being sold and that final transaction was happening, and folks, speaking of other countries and other cities, they were like, maybe we could have built housing on this, we could have built a park on this, and so we stopped the practice of selling public property, surplus property on the private market to the highest bidder, and instead held it and said to the Office of Housing, can you use this for affordable housing? If not, let's prioritize community organizations who are led by communities of color highest at risk for displacement, and let's put them first in line to get any surplus property. That's part of the way that the Africatown Community Land Trust and Homestead Community Land Trust property was built on previous city-owned property. That's how Habitat for Humanity built their property on city light-owned property in the past. And we are stopping the sale of any of these public properties in the future and prioritizing it for housing. We've also used American Rescue Plan Act funds to do rapid acquisition. That means we took 7 properties off the private market in the last year. We're converting those to affordable housing, and that's going to be 5,400 units of affordable housing in the pipeline, 4,000 of those units going online this year. So I'm really thrilled about some of these local tools, but we clearly have to do more to undo these historic wrongs.
There are 2 points I guess I would add to that. One is getting back to the federal government. I think it's really important. I don't know that, I would assume people in the room know this, but it's really important to understand how different the federal government treats housing than it does other areas. So if you are eligible for food support in the United States, food stamps, it's now called SNAP, if you are eligible, you get it. 100% of people who are eligible get food support. If you are eligible for housing support, federal housing support, 1 in 5 people get it. 1 in 5. So through that policy decision, the feds have pushed a very significant problem down to state, county, and city governments. And it's the biggest line item in each household budget. They have said, figure it out. And so it's easy for me to say because it doesn't look like I'm blaming anyone else, but I was on a panel with Executive Constantine last week, and I just said, we absolutely need help. We need help from the feds, and that looks fleeting now, unfortunately. It was looking a little more promising a few months ago, but that's really important. So that would be point 1. Point 2 that I want to make is the $1 billion number that comes from McKinsey is a big number. But when we put it in context of the wealth that exists in this region and the regressive tax system we have at the state level, it is an incredibly easy number to achieve if we wanted to do it. We talk about the percentage increase in state tax revenue that would be needed to meet the McKinsey number in the book. No one would notice. No one would notice. It's a question of politics and will, and if we're willing to do that. We have made massive investments in this region before, $50 billion plus on transit over the next 25 years. It didn't change anyone's life once that was approved. Okay? The problem is that housing is viewed as a private good, while transportation is considered a public good. And what's happening, and the crisis is an opportunity, narratives are shifting on that. The fact that Amazon and Microsoft are using corporate funds, not philanthropic funds, but corporate funds for housing, demonstrates that they're very worried. This is an existential threat to them. Right? And therefore, framing this as more infrastructure investment will help not only Amazon and Microsoft, but it will help a 3rd grade teacher who works in the Seattle Public School Systems be able to live and work where he or she teaches. So I think part of it is ultimately we have, in expensive coastal cities like ours, we have to reframe housing as infrastructure. And that a failure to do so and a failure to build it will mean this is a city that doesn't work anymore and a community that will no longer work anymore. You can't have a community without firefighters, without school teachers, without nurses, and without school service workers. You can't. Certainly not a community I want to live in.
Thank you. So we are coming up to the top end of our time, and we had asked folks to submit questions for the Q&A session here, and if there are any, please pass them my way. I will ask you as panelists to just close us off here on one critical issue. As policy wonks, we love getting into the weeds and talking about the nuances of policies, but one of the main goals that we really push for is that policy work is grounded in equity, because housing is an equity issue at its core. What strategies are you pursuing? What policies are you pursuing in really advancing equity overall? And let this be your closing statements.
I think that this is a question that needs to be part of every single policy deliberation. It cannot be a separate analysis at the end, whether or not there's certain racial equity goals being met. In 2018, when I first got into office, we asked for a racial equity toolkit to be conducted on our housing investment strategies. A, because we knew that what we were doing wasn't equitable. It wasn't leading to people having equal access to either renter opportunities or home ownership opportunities. And we knew as well in Minneapolis that they had used something similar to push for a zoning restructuring in their city. Now, it didn't take them 3 years necessarily to do it, but there was the pandemic in the meantime. And the racial equity analysis that we got back clearly showed what we all know. Without having access to affordable housing, denser housing options within the city where people live, where people retire, where people work, where people play, where people are activists, where people are students, they need to have housing in the cities that they work. Right now, we are the third highest mega commuter city in the entire country, meaning people are spending an hour, 2 hours in their cars just to get to work, like you mentioned in family experience. This is not good for the health of our community, it's not good for the health of our planet, and it is not good for the health of our economy either. So if we want to be honest about addressing housing, the first question should be this question in terms of what are we doing from a racial equity perspective to create more affordable housing, rental options, homeownership options for all income levels, and to truly densify how folks can live across our city. One specific thing that we've done, speaking of policy wonk and alphabet soup, is that we've increased, and Emily, I'll look to you to nod to make sure I get this term right, but we've increased the ability for community preference and for affirmative marketing to be used in this city. And really that means screw you I-200 and Tim Eyman and all the terrible people who tried to say that we shouldn't be looking at racial equity analysis when we conduct public policy. Now when we develop affordable housing, the first thing we're asking is, what can we do to affirmatively market to the folks who've been at highest risk of displacement? We talked about the Central District and making sure that the first folks getting into the new homeownership opportunities came from Central District and were at highest risk of displacement. With affirmative marketing and community preference, we're saying the community who has been here, who has been at risk of not getting loans in the past, not being allowed to live in the city, whether through rental or home ownership options, we're going to give that community preference and we're going to affirmatively market to them. And the last thing that we did, as I mentioned earlier, was even within the housing development world, we said our preference is going to be giving funding to those community organizations who are made up by, meaning leadership, staff members, board members, made up of folks who are at highest risk of displacement, i.e. communities of color, who are rooted within communities who are serving those who are at highest risk of displacement. So think of Africatown, El Centro de la Raza, so many other of your members. We put them at the front of the list to get access to funding first. So we will continue to fight for more strategies to make sure that the racial equity analysis is the first thing that we think of, and increasing the pie so that we can truly have more funding going towards things is really important. And thank you, shout out to Senator Hasakala, who's been continuing to push for a state bank. As we think about pushing out more revenue options and creating less scarcity, that's part of the model in terms of how we broaden out the available dollars and then really just continuing to put at the front of the list the folks who've been at highest risk of displacement and most harm are those past and current historic practices.
Yeah, I agree with everything Teresa said. Equity to me means putting resources where the needs are greatest, and it also means a secondary definition which we don't do enough of, which is making sure that the people who are most impacted are leading and shaping the work. And that, for some reason, that second point gets drowned out a lot because the people who are most impacted tend to also be the ones who are who have the least access to influence and to power. And so whenever we're in a room looking around a table, shaping a policy, if that policy is intended to benefit unhoused people, how many unhoused people are at the table right there helping to shape that policy? If our policy is intended to benefit incarcerated people or formerly incarcerated people, how many of those people are around the table shaping, not just as an afterthought coming in to put a validation stamp, but really early on at the beginning of the process, shaping that. And I think if you go about doing that, you really create much more effective policies. One example that I'll give is our work in Skyway. To me, Skyway could end up being the blueprint, a model for how to invest and develop a neighborhood without displacing the people who live there right now. You know, if I go to other parts of my district, we haven't done a great job of that. The Central District, for example, gentrified, displaced. A lot of people who used to live there can't afford to live there anymore. South Seattle, same thing happening. Skyway, there's still a huge opportunity to make that happen. And we make that happen by partnering with the people who live in Skyway, who are at risk of displacement, who really know the neighborhood and have authentic relationships with their neighbors, and making sure that they are at the table shaping whatever policies that you're looking to implement. And so we work a lot with Skyway Coalition. Rebecca Berry is here as one of the many people who are, yeah, give her a round of applause. And so the idea there is, you know, we invest in that neighborhood. At the same time, we put in anti-displacement measures to make sure that the people who live there now can stick around long enough to benefit from those improvements. So we're building affordable housing. I know that Skyway Coalition is partnering with Kathleen Hosfeld, our award winner today, to make sure we have a community land trust to promote home ownership. We're putting in place rental assistance programs, right of first return programs, inclusionary zoning policies, and putting as much public investment as we can into housing in that neighborhood. And so I think that's a good model around equity, you know, partnering with people who live there, who are impacted, putting as much massive investment into housing, affordable housing as you can there, and also being very intentional and doing everything under an umbrella of anti-displacement strategies.
Let's give this panel a round of applause. This has been a wonderful discussion, and thank you all so much for your insights. In particular, elevating the need for resources to really address affordable housing needs for low-income people. We have one big opportunity that I want to elevate here, which is the Seattle Housing Levy, which is up for renewal in 2023. And we know that the Office of Housing does an incredible job, an amazing job of stewarding those resources. And they did that under the leadership of Emily Alvarado, who's over there, and now leads the work of Enterprise. And now we are really building the blocks as the Housing Development Consortium to get ready for the renewal of the levy next year. So I'm inviting you as a place of action there. Really leverage HDC as your resource to be engaged in that process as we begin to build the blocks for a campaign of renewing the housing levy and renewing our tradition and commitment to investing in affordable housing for over 40 years at this point. So with that, happy Affordable Housing Week. Once again, congratulations to Kathleen. Thank you, everyone.